Welcome to Decision Space, a podcast about the decisions in games and the only podcast that takes place right here in the decision space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan.
And I'm Jake.
And we're so excited to be with you this week to be talking about The Fox in the Forest, a trick-taking game published by Foxtrot and Renegade Games. How are you doing this week, Jake?
I am doing good. Happy that we're having some nice weather. Been getting outside more, so I'm feeling good. How about you?
Yeah, same. I hadn't thought about the weather, but having the sunshine hit for the first time in like 4 months on the back of a pandemic, it's amazing how much just a little bit of sunshine can make you excited to get out and move a little bit.
Totally. Yeah.
So let's get right into it. Do you want to kick it off with your synopsis this week?
Sure. My synopsis for The Fox in the Forest is The Fox in the Forest is like a macaron, the kind of French patisserie cookie that you get, the multicolored things, in that I think it's like really delightful, but ultimately not leaving me completely satisfied. And so to me, this is a delightful game, but it's just a 6 out of 10.
Fascinating. This is going to be an awesome episode. I can't wait. Okay. The Fox in the Forest is a masterpiece of game design that casts a spell on the classic trick-taking format, transfiguring it into something fresh, innovative, and electric. A perfectly balanced playstyle, Fox in the Forest approaches perfection and stands as an excellent example of making less more. 10 out of 10.
Wow.
I love this game. I think this game is like beyond brilliant, but it so much aligns with my taste, and I'm so excited that this is a 6 out of 10 for you and a 10 out of 10 for me. This is going to be great.
I can't believe that. Yeah.
We did it. We talked in earlier episodes about how we weren't sure when we were going to find a game where we didn't totally align. So here it is.
All right. Yeah, this is going to be good.
Yeah, so quick rundown. Fox in the Forest is a 2-player trick-taking game. It was, as I mentioned before, published by Foxtrot and Renegade Games in 2017. I think it was originally published by Foxtrot and then Renegade picked it up. And it is designed by Joshua Buergel. I hope I pronounced your name right, Joshua, if you ever listen to this. But it sort of does what I think a lot of people considered was the impossible in making a 2-player trick-taking game interesting. And we always do a rule synopsis to give you a little bit better sense for the game if you haven't played it. So I think we'll hop into that now and send it over to the recorded rules overview. The Fox in the Forest is a storybook-themed trick-taking game for 2 players. Each round, players are dealt 13 cards from the game's 33-card deck, which itself is comprised of 11 cards ranging in value from 1 to 11, from 3 suits: bells, keys, and moons. The cards not dealt to players are put into a face-down draw deck, and the top card of that is flipped over and represents the decree card for the round, the game's trump suit. Each round consists of 13 turns or tricks. Each turn, the player who won the last trick leads by playing a card from their hand. The opposing player must then play a card matching the suit on the card played by the lead player if they can. Then the player whose card is of the highest rank and suit wins. The crux of the game lies in its scoring system. Each round, players must decide if they're trying to win tricks or lose tricks based on their hand of cards. If a player wins 0 to 3 tricks, they're considered humble and granted 6 points for the round. If they accomplish this, their opponent will have won between 10 and 13 tricks because of the zero-sum nature of the game's scoring, making them, quote, greedy, meaning they'll receive 0 points for the round. If a player wins 7 and 9 tricks, then they're considered victorious and they'll receive 6 points. If this is the case, then their opponent will earn between 1 and 3 points for having been defeated. A game is played in full rounds until a player earns 21 points or more, and at the end of that round, the player with the most points wins. For one final twist, the game assigns unique powers to each of the odd value cards in the game. These cards have varying effects on play, such as making the losing player lead the next trick instead of the winning player, or allowing the player to manipulate the decree card. Trick-taking games can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around, so I definitely recommend taking a quick peek at the rules if trick-taking games are new to you, and just in general to help give you a better sense for how Fox in the Forest plays. So I think with that, you should have a fairly good sense of how the game plays. And if not, as we continue talking in this discussion, if you haven't played it before, I bet it'll it'll click for you as we go. But I wanted to kick things off, Jake, with just a discussion of sort of characterizing the decision space that this allows. And I think talking as much as we can about Fox in the Forest specifically, but contextualizing it, I think, within trick-taking games overall. And I think when I say that, one thing that I find really interesting about trick-taking games is generally they have that same structure of at the outset of every round, you have all of the decisions disposable to you at once that you're going to have for that round. You're dealt your hand of cards. In most trick-taking games, that's 13 cards, given the way that the math works out. That's also 13 cards here in Fox in the Forest because of the way that they have shaped the game with the 3 suits. And I personally think that creates, in terms of the decision tree, it's very interesting because you start with this like very broad tree at the beginning that prunes down.
Yeah. So yeah, just to be transparent, I think I'm going to be really relying a lot on your expertise of trick-taking games in general. So I've played Fox in the Forest a bunch with my wife and primary gaming partner. I've also played The Crew a few times, and that's like the bulk of my experience with trick-taking games. And those two are like notoriously like separate from traditional because Fox in the Forest is the 2-player version of trick-taking, and The Crew is like the cooperative version of trick-taking. So, maybe I played like, a round of like hearts or spades here or there, but never, with that much enthusiasm or interest. So like I think people will be hearing a little bit of a difference in just sort of how we're coming to this. So with that said, to your question, I feel like the decision space is, while it's, can be robust just in the number of cards at the beginning, like I feel like so much of what you're doing in the game is like dictated to you with the opportunities to influence, more intermittent throughout the play of the game.
That's really interesting. So basically, you feel like your decisions are limited to those 13 cards, and then Fox in the Forest does some things to invert that you feel like the game ends up being, there's lots of potential choices, but not a lot of interesting decisions in the way it plays out.
I wouldn't say like not interesting decisions, right? Like that's a totally different dichotomy from like the size of the decision space. But like sure. I would say the decision space to me feels small, and I think largely because not only like when you're playing the game, you have to follow suit, right? If you can. And so frequently, even though you have 13 cards at the beginning of a round, if you're not leading, for instance, you really may only have, 2 or 3 choices because those are the cards in the suit that you can play. So like the whole rest of your hand, doesn't factor into that. And that's kind of like a repeating pattern throughout the play of the game.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think breaking down a distinction between the leading and following decision spaces seems important because I totally agree that there's that switching of, okay, when I'm following, my viable choices, the decision space is so much more limited. But I think that sometimes even then there's, especially in Fox in the Forest, because of cards like the Witch, which acts as the trump suit, even if it's not of the trump suit, or even the Fox, which lets you change the trump suit as you go, gives you a lot of flexibility and making meaningful decisions in terms of timing. Is it the right time within this round for me to play this card to change the trump suit, right? Like, and affect that power even on the follow. And then when you're leading, there's so many potential decisions that you have. Like, not that many games give you 13 potential different decisions that you can make at the outset. And even in viable decisions, depending on your hand, there might be 10 viable decisions. And that's a lot of decisions to make at the outset. In terms of a play experience and the shape of a game can take, that's, to me, it's interesting how you have this pruning effect as each round goes on. And I think as your decisions wean, what could be in your hand becomes more clear. But because of the amount of uncertainty, the tension really does grow as the rounds go on. Sometimes more than others. Some rounds can feel very rote and played out by the end, but others, it's so as the decisions pair, the tension rises immensely. And I think that's partially why I love this game, is it can be so exciting to see how it plays out.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you. I definitely want to reiterate that even when you're following and you're choosing between two cards, that can be really interesting and meaningful, especially as the card powers, which we're going to get into all of them later on, are concerned. But even when I'm leading the trick, I think just I'm perceiving the decision space maybe as smaller than you are because once, and I'm reminded of our conversation on Res Arcana a little bit. Like once I've sort of initiated beginning to play out my hand, and maybe this is just like a me thing, and I'm not playing the game right at all. But like typically, I find myself like, okay, if I'm going to start with the blue suit, the keys or whatever in this game, I find myself like blue, 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 right? Like I feel like I'm like going down that path. I'm rarely like reevaluating all my options anew, in each subsequent trick
Interesting.
of the game.
So I definitely see what you're saying, and I think that for me, there are definitely turns of the Fox in the Forest where things feel very rote. But because trick-taking games are fundamentally about information, so I am dealt a hand of information, and then much of how I'm approaching playing the game is trying to get more information about what is in my opponent's hand, so I can use that against them and exploit them by using the power of the trump suit to shape the overall results how I want them to be. And I think because of that, for me, every round, when I get more information, it changes how I might approach it in some way. And sometimes that information just confirms how I'm going to approach the hand. Like, yes, what I assumed would be the shape of play I was going to take ends up being that. And sometimes I get information and it changes wildly. Or in the Fox in the Forest, my opponent will do something and change something about the game state that fundamentally alters how I have to approach it as well. And I don't, like you mentioned, we're going to get into all the cards at the end and go through their individual powers. So I think as much as possible, it's good that we save that. And I think that will be a really rich way to talk about the decisions in the game. But I guess really quickly too, you mentioned sort of your background with trick-taking games. So I feel like it would be helpful for the listeners to know my background with trick-taking games. And I've come into trick-taking games mostly growing up. I played a lot of card games, but my family didn't play a ton of trick-taking games. We played a lot of Rummy, but my wife loves trick-taking games. So she grew up playing them at camp. Went through a phase where like every night before bed, she would just play spades on her phone to go to sleep. So she's like, in terms of like her core game playing favorite is like trick-taking games. We play bridge sometimes, so I'm very comfortable with trick-taking games. And I think I love them in part because she loves playing them. So I definitely have played trick-taking games a lot. I don't know. Sorry for sort of shoving that in like a wedge after my last comment that you probably had a good response to, and then I totally upended it. But
no, I think that is really important information, and probably gets perhaps to some of our fundamental like differences in how this game strikes us. I have a follow-up question for you though, which is how skill intensive do you think this game is, like on the line between skill and luck?
I think that this game is highly skill intensive. How skill intensive do you think it is?
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Okay.
I feel like obviously this is not a perfect information game. It's not chess. Like there are random elements that come up from the power and just the cards you are dealt. I think that a better player at the game, almost regardless of the cards they're dealt, will be able to craft a winning hand.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like the amount of uncertainty in the game is almost perfect, and I think that's one thing that I love about it, because it gives players just enough information to have really meaningful decisions, in my opinion, at every turn, but just enough uncertainty to make it still exciting. So if you totally knew what a trick-taking game where you have perfect information is not very interesting. There's games like Bridge that play with that idea a little bit. So everyone has their own hand, and that's a partnership game. So if we played that together, you always play with 4 players, and there's one player, it's a bidding game. I'm not going to explain all of Bridge, but basically one player's hand is open, completely open information, and they're sitting that turn out, and their partner is playing their own hand and that hand. So I think that the Fox in the Forest sort of takes a similar idea that both players have complete information, and then they have not perfect information of what are in the 6 cards in the deck, and then the one card that gets turned up as the trump suit, the decree card. And then the woodcuts help you sort of mess with that information. And I think that for me is why the game comes alive. And maybe we can shift into different ways that we would characterize the decision space, sort of the emotional experience of the game. And I think for me, one of the reasons I love Fox in the Forest so much is because of the ability for a really bad hand to feel like a horrible, horrible gut punch, or a really good hand to feel super triumphant. There's just like feats that you can accomplish in this game that feel wonderful. Or there's certain cards that come down where you're just elated that it played out in the way that it did, and it was completely unexpected. And I think for me, that's why this game goes from something like a 9 to a 10.
Yeah, I think you're right on. The thing that's most fun about this game to me is the sort of feeling derived from this like really simple like trick taking game, which is not something like when I hear trick taking game, that does not like excite me. That's how I'm coming to this. It is not like, oh, this is going to be a high emotion game, but Fox and Forest really does infuse that. It's amazing how often it comes down to the last card revealed, being a swing of, and we'll get into the scoring, which is, I think, phenomenal as a little preview. And then the scoring does so much to really bring that alive, where that last card can be, the swing of 6 points very frequently. And the other thing you said that I totally agree with, and I just love this about games in general, is when it presents like the opportunity to like achieve a perfect hand, which is like totally attainable in this game, but like super hard. And that would be winning all the 7s and no other tricks. I'm such a weirdo that like I'll probably just keep playing this game until I pull that off. Even if I didn't like it that much, like it would keep me coming back just for that alone.
Totally. The sort of, it's really interesting how there's core objectives based on the scoring system, and then there's like overarching meta goals of like, I accomplished this thing and it's a story that I'm going to tell someone about. The range of emotions that I feel while playing Fox in the Forest, or can feel, really surprises me for a numbers on cards game with like less than 40 cards in it. It gives the decisions that it invites you to make. I think I do feel cunning like a fox sometimes. Sometimes I feel so smart and clever in the way I play things out, right? And like you can like break people's ankles in this game almost with the way that you play your hand out, sort of like you might in basketball. And
my God, I can't believe you're making a basketball reference. I already have my pump fake reference lined up for later.
In this podcast or a different one?
This podcast, nice. Yeah. I have a pump fake analogy coming up later. Just and people have already been making fun of us in comments on this show for like how often we lean on sports analogies for like a board game podcast.
It's true, but I don't know. I just feel like sports pull out some of the most like sort of electric moments in games, and I think that they make an easy graft onto games where you have moments that feel sort of electric like that. Yeah. So I don't know. In terms of decision spaces, like I loved Underwater Cities, and I thought the decision space there was really rich. But generally, I almost feel like the decision space and the type of emotions that can be elicited are almost richer in Fox in the Forest. Like the range of things I might feel when I sit down to play Fox in the Forest on a purely emotional level are probably greater. And the intellectual stimulation isn't quite as high, but it's pretty close. And when I'm just trying to relax, I think that the pattern of playing out cards can be really exciting. So I think I'd be curious what your take is. You sort of felt like it was kind of rote in how you play hands. So what I'm saying, is it just like crazy to you? Like you can't believe that I'm talking about the game in this way?
No, not at all. I think that's like a very well put and a super compelling reason why, this game is easy to recommend. And, I think you're right. And I think a lot of people have that experience. What I will say, though, is because of the high skill level of this game, like this game is a lot closer to chess than it is to Uno or something like that for a simple card game. And you have to be functioning on the same level of strategic understanding to get anything out of this game. Yeah. And I think for that reason, if you're playing, if chess is your main 2-player game and you're playing with somebody and developing that skill at the same time and are always on an even level of playing, then I think everything you said of this game would also be true of chess, right? Like super high emotional bandwidth. But if one person is winning all the time, then that might not be, you're not likely to experience that same emotion, like scale of emotions. Like one person will be feeling good and one person will be feeling bad consistently. And then the person feeling good starts to not feel as good about that. And that's kind of closer to my personal experience playing with my wife.
Totally. Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. And I can very much see how the game would fall flat then, because the game doesn't give players a lot of tools. The luck, for all intents and purposes, is very low. So in an unmatched, it's just so tough to even the playing field without like passing along strategy and sort of talking through how you're playing. And I could see how the game for a given pair of players would come to a logical conclusion sort of forever. Like one player will end up better for the most part.
Yeah.
Okay, so I feel like that is the perfect moment to sort of shift over into the scoring system because it shapes so much about this game. We talked about it in the rules explanation, so we don't need to explore it too much in depth here. But do you want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, Jake, that you think the scoring system is the most important aspects of the game. Do you want to talk about sort of why that is and maybe couch that in the decision space itself to some extent?
Man, I'll give it a shot. Let's see if I can. Yeah, so the reason I think the scoring system is easily my favorite part of the game. And I think the reason the scoring system works so well is because, unlike most games where more points are strictly better, this allows the ability for you to try to do poorly. And if you're able to achieve that and gain only 3 tricks or less over the course of the 13 trick round, that's actually the best possible outcome for you. And the reason that makes the decision space so interesting to me is because there's always something in the back of your mind making you question, like, it's not just a matter of, yeah, I'm doing really well and gaining a lot of tricks. You're always like, wait, am I doing too well in this moment? Like, do I need to find an opportunity to like subtly throw a trick to my opponent at this point in the game? Or is it already too late? So I think that, just that little riff on a traditional scoring system, it just, brings this game alive, both in terms of like how it actually works mechanically, but also brings out so much of the emotional resonance you were speaking to before.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard people discuss the scoring system in the in the Forest as the game, and I think that that's a slight mischaracterization because I think it creates the game, and the game being that every single trick you have to decide, am I trying to win tricks or lose tricks at this exact moment? So the game of the Fox and Forest at its most basic level is trying to judge at this exact moment in the game, whether it's I've been dealt 13 cards and I'm trying to decide, am I trying to win here or am I trying to win the most tricks or not win tricks? Your ability to evaluate that based on the cards in play, the information that you have, that becomes the game. And that's the core skill of the Fox and the Forest. And I think that's what makes it unique for me. And what makes it so interesting is because every single trick, every single round, you have to reevaluate yourself and ask yourself that. And then you also layered on top of that are saying, am I doing a good enough job of not communicating what I'm trying to do? Because you could really overplay your hand and end up in a position where like, oh no, they know I'm trying to get 0 tricks. They're going to start sandbagging and just force me to take tricks, and I'm totally screwed.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that also, and not only are you trying to think about like, what am I trying to do at this moment, but what is my opponent trying to do? Because it's very possible that at a certain point in a game, you could be trying to lose tricks while your opponent is trying to win them. And knowing that information, can allow you to get just a little bit more value out of your hand. Or, if you, right? Because your goals are actually aligned, but your opponent doesn't know that yet. So I think that's really interesting. And, that also is what enables so much fun second guessing too, So anyway, how does that strike you?
No, I completely agree. I think the sort of double think that it puts on top of the game and the potential for bluffing just makes the core loop of playing tricks more interesting, because you're communicating more than just within any given trick itself. And I think compounding with that, the scoring system works really well in any given one round, but the fact that you're playing to 21 and the way that the points are doled out fixes a potential problem in the game, which is that at some point how the round is going to potentially play out. But I think that the way that the scoring system is designed, and then adding in things like the treasure that can give you extra points and muddy that a little bit, ends up being really interesting, because it makes understood rounds where more or less what's going to happen. It still makes individual tricks matter, because you care about the overarching round structure of the game. And I think the Fox and the Forest is one of the games that I've played in sort of the modern board game space that sells to me the importance of rounds. And helps me appreciate that you can build a really sort of small game with a simple core loop, and then add a meaningful round structure and sort of turn that on its head.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing that I think that the scoring system allows is sort of, and you're getting to it with the bluffing. It's like, if you can bluff in a game, it allows like a really fun extra element on top of that, which is like, how you can like sell bluffs or not. And this is something that people definitely disagree on, like if it's okay to even do in a game, which it would be, for example, you play a card hoping your opponent beats you, and then they do take the trick and you go, oh no, what a mistake I've made, to like mislead your opponent. And some people think that's not okay at all. I love that. Yeah. That's something I, think is a really important and fun thing in games, and specifically in card games like that. And so if, both people are just trying to get as many points as possible in a given round, like that wouldn't work out at all. So I just like that the scoring system enables those kind of fun moments. Is that something you do in your plays?
Definitely. I feel like it's interesting when people say they don't like when people do that, because in a way, what you're doing in that situation is just amplifying an emotional reaction that you would have, right? Like if you're just playing a normal game, you're going to react to a situation. So are they saying you don't want to have any emotion in your play? They would just like to be playing against a robot, right? And I guess it's different when you're saying it to intentionally mislead. But
So I mean, we got into a really interesting discussion in this in the Keyforge podcast and on the Keyforge Discord that we're both members of, which is like, if you're like trying to get your opponent to like kill a certain creature by like hovering your hand over it, like as if you're already gonna remove it because it's like such an obvious choice, and like little flourishes like that where you're trying to manipulate your opponent into doing something that isn't just like directly applicable to the game. Like I think that's totally fine and fun and enriches the gaming experience for all, but I kind of understand why people don't like that. And I think it's inherently the same thing here if you're giving a false emotional reaction to give false information to your opponent. And to me, that is like a pump fake, right? Totally. It's like as core to the game as like pretending to shoot the ball in basketball to make the opponent fly by and give you a wide open jump shot.
Definitely. And I feel like you hit on it perfectly, and it just depends on the magic circle that you're playing in, right? So if the other player is down and has a sort of tacitly agreed to those rules, then it like enriches the game space. I will say I would love to be able to do that more, but my wife can tell when I'm lying so easily that I can't pump fake her anymore with those sorts of plays. So I have to be even more subtle and hope to muddy the waters that way. Or like make in-game strange plays, like just doing weird stuff, like leading a suit with like a 6 at the outset. It's like you're not committing one way or the other just to get information. And then she'll be like, what are you doing? Why are you making these weird choices? To throw her off a little bit that way. And I love that. So the game like mechanically allows for that too. I guess too, to pitch you an idea, Jake, something that I want to, we'll sort of take this little detour and then come back. But I think that the Fox and the Forest employs a sort of rules/game design idea that I haven't heard discussed elsewhere that I want to talk about. And I think it will fit the conversation well. And the idea here that I've come up with is called a rules turn. So a rules turn is a rule that is structured in a way that you say a rule and you give the whole rule. So in the Fox and the Forest, you are trying to win tricks in the game, but if you win too many, you actually lose. So that but is the signifier in a rules turn that helps you, that shifts the core gameplay on its head. So another example would be in High Society, a game by Rainer Knizia. You are trying to win the most cards, but if you spend too much money, you automatically lose. If you're the player who spent too much money, you automatically lose the game. I think Rainer Knizia games do this the most. Like in Tigris and Euphrates, you're trying to get the most influence cubes, but your score with the fewest cubes is your overall score. Things like that. And I think that rules structured that way, I don't fully understand why they make for such interesting game spaces, but I think those rules turns can make for really interesting play spaces. And the Fox and the Forest is a good example of this.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. You came up with that?
Yeah.
Wow. No, I think that's just trying to like understand like how much credibility to give this idea. Like I don't, before I just trash it, I want to make sure it's not like coming from like Reiner Knizia. No, not at all. I think it's interesting, and to me, what that just points out is something we've gotten in a lot of our discussion of decision space, which is that like the interesting thing most often is decisions when there's a trade-off, and when you have a rules turn as you're outlining it, like that is an inherent trade-off core to the game itself.
Yeah, totally.
So I think maybe that speaks to why that's so interesting.
I love too that Fox in the Forest makes the scoring system evocative. They didn't have to add a description of what different scores, trick amounts or trick bands means, but the fact that like 0 to 3, if you get 0 to 3 tricks, you're quote unquote humble, while your opponent is greedy. Or if you're somewhere in between, you're just defeated and victorious. I think that adds a lot to the game and shows a level of understanding of like what imbuing emotion and then allowing the players to run with that becomes so fun. Like I love sort of pointing at my wife and be like, "Oh, you're so greedy," and it sort of invites you to have that type of banner.
I've had that same experience, and like I would say, like I agree. It definitely makes it more emotionally evocative in the sense that like it is just so incredibly salt inducing to the greedy person. Like not only did you get the fewest points, you got 0 points, where your opponent got all the points, and the game is making fun of you and insulting you.
Yeah,
right. Like so, I mean, like I think it definitely makes it emotionally evocative, and it's funny. But it could like legitimately trigger people. Like,
yeah,
I do
definitely.
the thing where I'm like, oh, I'm so humble. Obviously not like the most humble. Like that would of course be somebody else because like I wouldn't say I'm the most humble. And my wife is just like pulling her damn hair out.
And I love that the rules invite this. Like they want you to be playful that way. Otherwise they wouldn't have said that. So that's another way in which not just mathematically, but just on a sheer like, I don't know, linguistic level, the game's inviting you to play in that way. And it didn't have to, but it does.
Right. It's making it a story. It's leaning into the storytelling elements that all games have. And, in many ways, I think trick-taking games are, pretty far from, as far from like a storytelling game as you could get on that spectrum, right? These are mathy games, but they've really taken important steps and I think really valuable steps to make the story in this game come alive in a way that would be so easy to have the same version of this game, same rules, that just feels like, you're playing with a standard deck of cards.
Totally. Very mathematical and rote. The whole ship here seems to be shaking a little bit, and I can feel some uneasiness in your voice. So maybe we can jump into some turbulence.
This is your captain speaking. We are now approaching a little bit of turbulence. Please return to your seats and buckle your safety belts.
So I guess this is kind of my show at this point, since you've given this game a perfect 10 out of 10. But I do have a couple of concerns. I think that one of which is what we've already brought up, that like I think because this is a strictly 2-player game that is so skill intensive, that it's difficult to have like a super balanced meta between any two people. And it sounds like, you have one which is great. And I can definitely see how like satisfying and fun that would be. But my experience playing with my wife was when we first broke this game out, I probably played it, 15 to 20 times. She won the first 3 rounds or 4 rounds. And I just had no idea what was happening in the game. Like I was just learning it. It just felt like when I first learned this game, like not playing trick taking games, it felt super random, right? I was just like playing it. It took me a little while to like really start grokking any strategic elements of it. But in the, and then it was really a game we were enjoying and it was like 50-50. But now I've won the last like, I think 5 or 6 games that we've played and she's just not having fun with it anymore. So doesn't have, and if we played, 20 more games, perhaps she would surpass me and we would come to some kind of equilibrium, but she's just not really interested in playing anymore. Last time we played, she kind of said that she wasn't having fun with it. And, I, being the more interested gamer in our household, like the last thing I want to do is like put games that Bridget isn't enjoying in front of her. I want her to keep wanting to play games. So that's kind of like the death knell for me for this game. And then because I've already had that like learning experience with it, like I think it'd be really fun to play with you and maybe some other people. But I couldn't really break it out with other friends who, theoretically friends will come around at some point again in the future. And I wouldn't be able to break this out with them, I think, and have a very fulfilling game either. So I think like, and that's not like a problem with the game, but just like know that, it's kind of like chess in that way. And I think it's kind of suffers from the same kind of thing chess does in that regard. And then I guess another kind of issue I have with it is, and you said you think the scoring is really interesting. I do too, but I don't necessarily like the round scoring as much. I just think going all the way up to 21 points seems like frequently we'll be in a situation where you will get to like the last round is almost inevitable. Like you almost don't need to play it because like somebody is like 1 or 2 points away from winning and the other person is many more than that. So like the only reason to play the game then would be to like try and like literally skunk your opponent, which I think is like nearly impossible to do if your opponent is playing to like get only 1 or 2 points. Like that's almost always achievable. So like 3 rounds feels kind of like a perfect or, but the fact that it frequently goes to 4 and it's like more, it's like to me that last round, I guess feels like very procedural. Or would make maybe somebody maybe at that point somebody should just concede, but then that can feel lackluster to people. And then I think so sometimes I guess like to me it just feels like it goes a little long for what it is. And then and I guess the last thing I would say just for me, like I think there are like a lot of things that are really great about this game, but like it's definitely not the game like I personally have had just like the most fun with. I think I would recommend this to other couples, especially, if like you want to like, this could be our game, we'll just play this game a lot. And I think that would be a really, especially if you like trick taking games, like that is something that could really work for you. But like, if I ask myself, like, is this a game that I will frequently like want to pull off the shelf? Like if my wife's like, yeah, I'll play anything, whatever you want. Like I just don't see myself going to this game because while it's like good and I can acknowledge that, it just doesn't leave me feeling super fulfilled. Yeah, that's like my rating, right?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it makes a lot of sense too that the game has sort of played out for the two of you and you're sort of done with it. And it strikes me, it's so interesting to me that you brought up the term unbalanced because right before we started recording, I said to Maya, I was like, is there anything that you... like what stands out to you most about Fox in the Forest? Like, why is it something that has been living on our kitchen table? We talked about recording this almost 2 weeks ago, Jake, and the game has just kind of lived on our table for 2 weeks and we'll just play whenever we have like 20 minutes. Sometimes, by the way, too, the rulebook says if you want a shorter game, you can play to, I think it's 15 or a longer game, 35. I can't remember if I have those right. But so we've been playing like, let's play longer games. Let's play shorter games. And it's kind of just lived there. And she said that she felt it's one of the most balanced games she's played, and that's something she loves about it. Which that's just a testament to what you're talking about of us being so evenly matched in our trick taking skill level.
And I definitely think this game is balanced, right?
Yeah.
The unbalance would be between like the two players of the game.
Yeah.
There are plenty of games that are unbalanced and feel better for the losing player. Like unbalanced between the people, like unbalanced skill level. And it feels a lot better to lose because you know, if you're playing like a game of Azul, you've like built out your board, you know, you've like accomplished something. Whereas like this game, it's just like, there's nothing to like admire, feel like you've worked towards. And in fact, like the game might also just be like telling you like, stop being so greedy, stop being so greedy. Like, you know, so I think that might be particularly why like Bridget burned out on it quicker than other games.
That's interesting. I have 1 point of Turbulence, even though it's a 10 out of 10 for me. And that's that I think that the suits the design of them are slightly more complex than I would like them to be, just based on like classic card game suits. And I think that they could have gone with a simpler graphically designed key, a simpler graphically designed belt, and a simpler graphically designed moon. And it would have fit sort of within the classic card style a little bit better. But that's like such a base level nitpick that it feels silly to even say it.
It does. We're cutting that. No, it's like there's nitpicks, and then there's that. I was like, oh, I don't know, Brendan. That's starting to sound like a 9.95.
But I think that's a testament to just how much I enjoy the game.
No, totally, yeah.
Do you feel the ship sort
I think the suits look cool.
I will say I love the art in the game. I feel like the art is amazing.
Yeah,
the individual art. Do you have anything else on this bumpy, turbulent moment, or do you want to slip back into card by?
No, I'm ready to get back into. Let's get into the card by card, and probably just pretty quick on them. But I think there's some really interesting decisions that they bring up. So
instead of going bottom to top, I thought it'd be interesting to go top to bottom in terms of value. So let's start with the Monarch. The Monarch is the 11 that says when you lead this card, your opponent has. They have a card of that suit, they have to play their highest one or they have to play a 1.
Do you think that this is, and as a preview, I'm just going to ask you this every time, do you think that this is the most powerful card in the game?
I do not think this is the most powerful card in the game. I think this is a powerful card, but not. You don't either?
No, I'm just going to ask you that every time because I want to see if we agree on which one's the most powerful.
Interesting. So the Monarch does a lot of things. One of the most important things that it does for you is it gets you information almost always. But if they play a Swan, it can be sort of this devastating turn. And I think one thing that the Fox and the Forest does really well, one of the ways that you can come back in a trick-taking game is for exchanging value in a way. It's almost like a tempo trade, right? Like if you play the 11 and I play a 1, the average value of cards in our hand is probably become closer if I have a on average lower value hand and you have an on average higher value hand in terms of sheer value. If I can make exchanges that are disparate like that, I can bring the band closer. So if I'm trying to turn a hand that's like I'm going to win just below half the tricks, a play like that can really even my ability to come back. Interestingly, in our meta, the Monarchs get played really early pretty often just because it's a good way to force someone's hand and see what their highest in something is if they don't have a Swan.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's probably the card that I lead with most often. I think another interesting thing about it is, I guess we'll get into the 9 in 1 second, but the 9 is one of the cards that can frequently beat an 11.
Yeah.
So you can play an 11 into a situation where your opponent can actually beat you fairly often, or may even be forced to beat you. So that kind of can also be really interesting and enable like humble strategies where you're throwing away an 11 on purpose, the highest value card in the game, and forcing your opponent to win a trick. That could be something like a huge positive swing for you to really facilitate that humble strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you said something interesting that I want to highlight too there, which is that the Monarch is a card you like to lead with most often. And I think one thing that's great about the individual powers in the Fox and the Forest is that there's certain cards that are on average better as leads and on better as follows. And that's really interesting because in a lot of trick-taking games, for the most part, cards are cards. Not always, but for the most part. And having that sort of differing value based on your position is very interesting in terms of decisions. So let's pivot down to the Witch then. So the Witch is the 9, and this is the card that says if there's no other Witch in play, it counts as the trump suit. So you play it to follow. Let's say the decree, the trump suit is a key. Jake, you play the 11 Moon. So the trump is a key. I have the Moon Witch. I can follow with the Witch, and then I'll win the suit. If you haven't played the Fox and the Forest, you're probably like, this is mind-melting. The Witch, I think, is also a super interesting card because it's very powerful. Do you think this is the most powerful card in the game?
I do not, Brendan. Do you?
I do not think this is the most powerful card in the game. But I do think it's pretty powerful and pretty interesting and shifts the feel of the game and helps it not always feel like you know exactly how hands are going to play out. Because sometimes if your Witch matches the trump suit, it's significantly less powerful than if it doesn't match the trump suit. And that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think astute listeners may also realize that we skipped the 10. And so, you know, just to reiterate, all the even numbered cards in the game work the same, but don't have any additional power. So only half of the deck has these, or a little more than half, I suppose, has these powers. I think the 9 is fine. I mean, it's maybe perhaps like a little less interesting. And I would actually perhaps argue that it might be one of the worst powers because there are many times when you wish the 9 was just a regular 9 and it puts you in a position where like you have to win. So, I mean, I think that's something to just be like aware of, that the more 9s you have in your hand, like it can put you in a position where you basically have no option but to try and win a lot of tricks. And that can, if your opponent's trying to go humble or you have an otherwise bad hand, it can put you in a really bad situation, I think, almost as often as it helps you, if not more so. So I don't really like when I have 9s in my hand.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's a powerful upside, but a potential powerful downside. Because
I feel like it restricts my, the decision space.
Your strategy.
Yeah.
I also, since you mentioned that only some of the cards, only the odd valued cards are powers, I think really quickly this would be a good time to mention that I think that that's brilliant. It gives players just enough of a break. If every card was a power, this game would be so horrible. It would be way too much. And also, I think it's brilliant that the suits are layered on top of the powers and that they didn't decide that every suit should have its own set of unique powers. I think that makes the game so much more interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I mean, I'm also excited for the inevitable expansion where it brings powers to the other half of the deck, and then the third expansion where you draft sleeves to customize your deck even further.
Drafting sleeves for a trick-taking game sounds amazing.
The Fox in the Forest on Jupiter in a different galaxy.
I love it. Okay, so the next card in numerical order is the treasure, the 7. So this is the card that when you win a trick with a 7 in it, you get 1 point. So it doesn't matter that you played the 7; it matters if you win the trick with the 7 in it.
Do you think this is the most powerful card in the game?
I do not think this is the most powerful card in the game.
Neither do I.
I think that similarly to the 9s, the 7 are like kind of like workhorse designs in that they add a lot to the game, but I don't always want to have them in my hand. I feel like sometimes 7s can feel like a problem I have to solve rather than a tool that I get to use.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the 7s, like the fact that you can get 1 point by winning a 7 really creates interesting situations. It can also sometimes lead to those problematic scoring situations where the last round is just like inevitable, just going through the motions. So I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit conflicted on this, but I think the fact alone that like there are these cards that's like, okay, but I really like, I want to, this is the strategy I'm going for, whether it's to be victorious or humble, but like in that, can I also achieve winning these
More
sevens to get even more points? It is kind of like a fun puzzle to work out and does kind of create some more interesting decisions. I'm glad, I guess overall I'm glad they're there.
I'm really glad they're here too, because I think if the sevens being present in the game means that at some core level, it incentivizes winning within a round. The balance of like, you want to be victorious more often than you want to be purely humble and win no treks at all. It leans a little bit more towards being victorious because getting more points from the treasures is good. And I think that slight imbalance makes it less common that you would be humble and makes it more exciting when it does happen. And I think that's good for the overall health of the game, that winning is slightly incentivized because of the sevens, even though the greater overall points don't necessarily lean totally that way. I think when you average it out, it does too. But I think the sevens are important. And then also when a round is basically fundamentally decided, I do think that it can cause overarching issues. Having the sevens being present can make a hand that's almost solved still interesting. Because in bridge, sometimes
within any given hand,
exactly,
a given trick can matter even if like, okay, I've already lost this.
Yeah. Sometimes in bridge, you'll get to a point where the player who they're leading and they're playing the dummy hand will just like literally play down their cards, and you'll skip like the last 3 turns because you just know that you're going to win because you have the highest value cards in a row of the trump suit, right? Like I have the king, the queen, and the jack, and I know that there's no chance I can lose suits. And I think that overall that's kind of boring, and I'm glad that's not in the Fox and the Forest because it's usually tense down to the last card. Okay, so coming up next, the humble woodcut. The woodcut says when you play this, draw 1 card and then discard any 1 card from your hand to the bottom of the deck face down. Do you think this is the most powerful card in the game, Jake?
I do.
Interesting.
So.
Okay, great.
Do you think so?
I think that I do not think this is the most powerful, but I do think this is a very powerful card.
I think, and perhaps the reason I think this is because it speaks to my strategy, which is like, or just how I play this game, where it's like, it's the opposite of the witch, which restricts your ability. The woodcutter gives you the most maneuverability of any card to shift your strategy if things are going wrong. Like perhaps you are starting out thinking like you have a really good hand and you're going to win a lot of tricks, and then you are surprised to find that your opponent has taken out a lot of your better cards through some variety of means. Like the woodcutter offers you an ability to switch a card in your hand that could be good for potentially a lower one. So yeah, that maneuverability. It also keeps that information secret from your opponent. So it's a card that's, I guess, the only card that's giving you more new information and not giving your opponent any. Where it's like, you talked about how the 11 does give you some information, but that's of course like information only your opponent already has. Yeah. Like now you've actually seen more cards than your opponent, which in such a high skill level game, I think is huge.
Yeah, I think you sort of nailed my thoughts on the woodcut too. I'd love playing hands of 2 or 3 woodcuts because when you get all of that flexibility, it can be really powerful. And I love that the woodcut enables both being humble and being victorious. It makes both strategies potentially more viable, and I think that's great. And then, like you mentioned, highlighting the information aspect of it is really important as well. The fact that you get more information than your opponent, I think that the woodcut does so much, and it's such a smart card design overall. Also, the fact that it doesn't force your hand, that you don't have to discard, that can be, I just think that's really great, that they give you that flexibility to play it out how you will. That brings us to the next card, which is the 3, the Fox. This card I do think is the most powerful card in the game. When you, like when I said no other woodcut, I played my hand, right? You knew I didn't think the swan was the most powerful.
I don't know. I was maybe you're just operating on like such a higher level of understanding than me, but.
No, so the fox is the card that says when you play this card, you may exchange a card from your hand with the decree card. So it allows you to manipulate the trump suit within a given round of the game. I love that this card it actually makes you feel cunning like a fox. And I think the reason for me why this is the most powerful card is because this is the card that can affect the most other turns the most dramatically. So like the woodcut can allow you to play out a strategy more effectively, but it's usually only affecting the power of one card. Whereas a fox played correctly can increase the overall power of more cards in your hand or weaken the overall power of more cards in your opponent's hand. Based on the information that you have on what's probably left the most dramatically. And if you can compound the effects of two foxes, that can be really, really powerful, especially if the decree card starting off is a very strong card that you would like access to.
Yeah, totally. I think it's like the most skill testing card in the game too. Like being able to figure out when the right moment to switch the suit is, especially, it could be obvious if it's like, oh, that's a really good card, I want that.
Yeah.
That then you can just do that. But even then, perhaps that's presenting your opponent with an opportunity to win an easy trick because it has a low base power, which makes it a little bit less flexible in terms of actually winning suits. So you might have to like factor that in with your thinking of like -1, but then I'll be able to change the trick to give me like a +2 or 3, just as you're like doing the mental arithmetic of how many tricks you're likely to be able to win. So I find myself like having difficulty on playing it right, choosing the right card to play and when. So perhaps that's why I don't think it's as powerful as you, just because like I'm probably not maximizing the value of it as much as the woodcutter, which is pretty obvious.
Yeah, and I think you mentioning too, like even if you just want the decree, like the timing of the fox is so important, like knowing when it's going to have the greatest impact. And I think it's really interesting that the fox is a card that's more powerful on the follow, but still strong on the lead. And it's more powerful on the follow because generally you can, if your opponent plays a card, you follow their suit, right? Let's say they play a moon. You follow with the fox that's matching the moon, and then you shift the suit. Or if you don't have any cards left of moons and you're able to play a bell and then swap the decree into the bell, it can just be, that's just like a blowout. And that feels so good.
Totally.
Okay, so that leaves one final card, which is the Swan, the one. What are your thoughts on the Swan, Drake?
Yeah, I don't know. So the Swan says if you play this and lose the trick, you lead the next trick. Swans come out often when as a follow to your opponent playing an 11. So I mean that's just an interesting dynamic of the card. So it doesn't give you a lot of choices. I think it can be huge. Because if it's not the second most powerful card to me, it's probably the third. And I think the reason for that is because it can be like this game is all about, to me, it's all about like tempo and who's controlling what when. Like if you're leading, your ability to influence the state of the game is so much greater than the person following. So choosing when to play ones to give yourself the opportunity to lead a trick, I think is often the difference in the round. Like, because if you doing it right away, your opponent is still going to have a lot of options left in their hand to maybe like take some of that back. Whereas if you can choose the right moment, then perhaps then you'll have the ability to lead for the remainder. I think it's another skill testing one too.
I totally agree. This is another skill testing one. I also think that it's very interesting because I think one thing that's important about trick-taking games that we've been talking about a lot is how important information is. Trick-taking games are fundamentally, the more information you have, the better decisions you can make. So I think in some ways, there's definitely times when you need to be leading, but following can be really rough. Or following can feel very powerful because you get the information of the card that your opponent's played. So in some ways, to me, the Swans effect feels like a downside for being able to play a really low-value card and sort of sandbag in that way. So I found that Swans can be similar to the Treasure. They can be really beneficial, but they can also be a strong downside that you have to play around because sometimes you just want to follow. And knowing when you can get the Swan out of your hand. Also, if you're trying to be humble, and you're dealt a hand of 3 swans, that can feel great. Just like, you have 3 guaranteed losses. Like, oh yeah.
But but at the same time, it can mess you up at the end of the game if you have a swan and now you have to lead. And if your opponent doesn't have anything in that suit, it's like, well, I guess you win again.
Yeah, sure.
That's also just another one of those just like gut punch moments where it's just like your opponent plays something that they're sure that they're going to lose with. And you're just like, oh, congratulations. Like you've won that trick. And it's like, no.
Totally, especially if they've set it up by kind of bluffing that they're out of that suit in a way, or maybe that they have a higher value card or a lower value card than you might think. There's a lot of room to like subtly communicate information and then subvert it, and I love that. Also, for final thoughts on these powers, I think that one thing I really love about Fox in the Forest and its design is that they decided to name these powers. These powers didn't have to have names. But by giving them names, I think that they make the act of playing a trick-taking game more accessible. Because for some people, like card counting is just an important skill in trick-taking games. That's kind of partially the game, is like understanding what cards have been played and what are still out there. And by adding in these evocative names to certain cards, I think for people whose minds aren't as numerically tilted, but maybe more just like conceptually, I think it makes that card counting potentially easier because you link it to an actual power that's happened. Mm-hmm. So I've found that my wife, she's way better at just like strictly card counting. But for me, it can be easier while playing the Fox in the Forest for me to do that because I almost always know if like the 11 Monarch has been played. Whereas if we're playing Spades, sometimes I'll forget like any given card has been played. And she'll be like, why do you do that? Like you knew this card was played. And I was like, actually didn't, I forgot. But with the Fox in the Forest, generally I'm able to remember a little bit easier, at least the powers, because of the evocative names. And that's cool to me.
Totally. Yeah. So, and I just like how simple they are too, right? Like all of these are one sentence, and it's just quick. Like it doesn't interrupt the flow of play. And if like the flow of play of this, like the flow of play in a trick-taking game has to be snappy and quick. Yeah. And if it slows down at all, that's just going to be a bad experience every time. So I think they're smart not to overcomplicate things. Hence why we were joking about the expansions being such a terrible idea.
Yes. Yeah. Though there's a follow-up game, the Fox in the Forest Duet, which I think is a funny name for a 2-player trick-taking game follow-up, but it's a co-op game. Mm-hmm. It's a co-op trick-taking game, which I guess is similar to The Crew, but just for 2 players. So that's one that I'm curious about taking a peek at in the future. But I guess
if anyone's played that and wants to share thoughts on Fox in the Forest or Fox in the Forest Duet, please let us know. You can reach out to us on Twitter at Decision Spa. That's Decision SPA, or leave a review or a comment wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah, we would love to hear your thoughts. We haven't gotten any official reviews on iTunes yet, or sort of on the podcatchers out there. So if you want to be the first person and you're a fan of the show, we'd love to hear from you. We're still trying to grow the podcast as much as we can. And we're really thankful for all you who have given us feedback so far and are out there listening. Do you have any closing thoughts on Fox in the Forest, Jake?
So my final thought is like, I think the difference in our reviews after talking about it, we came away with kind of different overall conclusions, but it seems like we really think about this game similarly. Like we agree a lot more than we disagreed as we were talking through the decisions and how fun and or engaging they are. But just the whole package to me left me feeling a little bit lackluster in a way that it left you feeling like totally fulfilled and wanting to keep playing more and more. And I think that's just a good lesson about, the subjectivity in game reviews, right? All we can do is kind of think critically about this game, play it, and then report back on our experience. And it seems like the biggest difference in how we interpret this was just, in our home meta and how that shook out.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's also interesting from a decision space reminder that different players have different experiences and tolerances for the amount of decisions that they're given, and how those decisions are perceived can be just as important as the consequences of. You've talked a lot about perceived balance is basically equal to balance. And I think perceived decision space is basically equal to decision space. And I think this discussion is a good reminder of that, because sometimes if you're dealt a hand of cards and it feels like this is the one way to play it functionally for you in that moment, that's the one way to play it. And I think that the sort of the way in which you get a hand of cards and that you're supposed to dictate it, that dictates your strategy and you can pivot. I think I love that about Fox in the Forest, but it's really interesting to me. And I could see how you could feel very rammed down a specific strategy based on your hand. And I think also one other destination or takeaway is I think that a lot of games are about building up, and Fox in the Forest, I think, is a great example of a game where a decision space can get smaller and still be interesting.
Yeah, well put. And hopefully this discussion, whether you have played this game and agree with Brendan or play this and your feelings are more closer aligned to me, or if you haven't played this game at all, hopefully our discussion of the decisions in it give you some further understanding or some idea about whether or not this might be a decision space that you would enjoy to exist within.
Totally. And I guess with that, if you are one of those players who is tracking closely along with decision space and you want to have experienced the games that we are talking about, next week on Decision Space, Jake and I are going to tackle into a big one. We're headed to the next frontier after the underwater cities. We're going to Mars. We're gonna dive into Terraforming Mars.
A game literally that could not be any less about building cities under the sea.
So give that a play, and there's an app implementation if you're stuck at home and you don't have folks to play with, but you want to give that a go. That's how Jake and I are going to be playing it primarily. So I think with that, give us a follow on Twitter at Decision Spa, like Jake said. Tell all your friends about Decision Space. Tell the person at the grocery store who you're running into about Decision Space.
Subscribe, ring the bell, baby.
And with that, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
You are now exiting the Decision Space. Thanks for listening. Please take care and enjoy the rest of your game.